The sun hung low over the frontier town of Bitter Creek, painting the dusty streets in shades of copper and rust. It was late summer of 1876, and the air shimmered with heat that rose from the parched earth like the breath of hell itself. The town, perched on the edge of nowhere between the civilized East and the untamed territories, was a collection of weathered wooden buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support against the relentless wind. Inside Murphy's Saloon, the largest establishment on Main Street, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of cheap whiskey. Men of every stripe crowded around rough-hewn tables, miners with dirt still under their fingernails, cowboys with trail dust on their chaps, soldiers from the nearby fort in their faded blue uniforms, and drifters whose professions were best left unquestioned. The piano in the corner played a tuneless melody, competing with the clink of glasses and the low rumble of masculine voices. At the center table, a high-stakes poker game was drawing a crowd. Big Jim Thornton, the town's self-appointed boss who owned the general store and half the property in Bitter Creek, was dealing cards with his fat fingers adorned with gaudy rings. Across from him sat various players, a Mexican vaquero named Miguel, a grizzled prospector called Old Pete, and a young lieutenant from Fort Stockton who looked barely old enough to shave. "Raise you 50, Big Jim announced, pushing a stack of coins forward. His piggy eyes gleamed with the confidence of a man who rarely lost at his own table. It was then that the saloon doors swung open, bringing a momentary gust of evening air. A woman entered, and conversations briefly stuttered to a halt. She was perhaps 25 years old, dressed in mourning black that had seen better days. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale face bore the kind of beauty that hard living had refined rather than destroyed. This was Margaret O'Brien, known to the town simply as the Widow. She moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, her gray eyes fixed straight ahead, ignoring the whispers that followed in her wake. Some said her husband had died in an Apache raid 6 months back. Others claimed he'd been shot in a dispute over water rights. The truth, like many things in Bitter Creek, remained murky. Well, Big Jim called out, his voice carrying across the room. "If it ain't the pretty widow, come to watch real men play cards?" Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued toward the bar without acknowledging him. That's when Big Jim, drunk on whiskey and his own importance, made a decision that would change everything. "Boys," he announced loudly, "I'm feeling generous tonight. Let's make this game more interesting." He gestured toward Margaret. "I'll wager the widow's debts against the pot. Win, and I'll tear up every cent she owes me for that shack she's living in. Lose," he grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth, "and she works off what she owes in whatever way the winner sees fit." The saloon erupted in coarse laughter and catcalls. Margaret froze at the bar, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden edge. The bartender, a decent man named Hank, leaned forward and whispered urgently, "Get out of here, ma'am, quick like." But before she could move, the saloon doors opened again. This time, the laughter died completely. The man who entered was tall and lean, moving with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. His copper skin gleamed in the lamplight, and his long black hair was held back by a leather band decorated with eagle feathers. He wore a mix of traditional Apache clothing and white man's garb, buckskin pants, a cotton shirt, and moccasins that made no sound on the wooden floor. A Colt revolver hung at his hip, and a knife was sheathed at his belt. This was Samuel Crow Feather, though few in Bitter Creek knew his name. To them, he was simply that Apache who sometimes came to trade horses and furs. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in everything, the tension, the fear, the woman standing rigid at the bar. "Apache!" Big Jim's voice boomed, trying to reassert his authority. "This is a private game." Samuel moved to the table with deliberate slowness, his hand resting casually near his gun. "I heard talk of a wager," he said, his English accented but clear. "The woman for the pot." "That's right," Big Jim replied, his bravado wavering slightly. "But this is a white man's game. I play." Samuel pulled out a leather pouch and dropped it on the table. It landed with a heavy thud, and when it fell open, gold coins spilled across the green felt, "Unless white men afraid of Apache gold." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Big Jim's face flushed red. To refuse would make him look like a coward, but letting an Apache sit at his table went against everything he believed in. The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. "Deal him in," the young lieutenant said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "His money's as good as anyone's." Big Jim glared at the soldier but nodded curtly. "Fine, but when you lose, Apache, you leave town and don't come back. When I win," Samuel corrected softly, "the woman's debts are mine." Margaret finally turned from the bar, her eyes meeting Samuel's across the smoky room. Something passed between them. Not recognition, for they had never met, but perhaps a shared understanding of what it meant to be considered property in a world that recognized only power. The cards were dealt, the crowd pressed closer, money changing hands on side bets. The Mexican folded early, followed by Old Pete. The lieutenant played conservatively, watching the Apache with professional interest. But the real game was between Big Jim and Samuel. As the pot grew, so did the tension. Big Jim sweated profusely, his rings clicking against his chips as he bet. Samuel remained perfectly still, his face unreadable as carved stone. Only his eyes moved, flicking between his cards and his opponent. "All in," Big Jim finally declared, pushing his remaining chips forward. "Let's see what you got, Redskin." Samuel matched the bet without hesitation. The moment stretched taut as they revealed their hands. Big Jim had 3 queens, a strong hand by any measure. His grin began to spread until Samuel laid down his cards. 4 tens. The saloon exploded in chaos. Some men cheered, others cursed. Money changed hands rapidly as bets were settled. Big Jim's face turned purple with rage, but he couldn't dispute the cards. The lieutenant quickly stood and positioned himself between the 2 men, hand on his service revolver. "The Apache won fair and square," he announced. "Anyone says different answers to the United States Army." Samuel rose from the table, gathering his winnings with methodical precision. Then he walked to where Margaret stood, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, relief at escaping Big Jim's clutches, fear of her new circumstances, and a defiant anger at being wagered like livestock. "You come with me," Samuel said simply. "I'm not anyone's property," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "No," Samuel agreed, "but you are in my debt now. Come." He turned and walked toward the door, not looking back to see if she followed. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret lifted her chin and walked after him, her boots clicking on the floorboards in counterpoint to his silent stride. As they reached the door, Samuel paused and looked back at the crowd. "The proud Apache won the widow in a game," he announced, his voice carrying a note of bitter irony that few would understand. Then they were gone, leaving behind a saloon full of men who would talk about this night for years to come. Outside, the desert night was falling fast, stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. 2 horses waited at the hitching post, Samuel's paint pony and a sturdy mare. Without a word, he untied both and handed the mare's reins to Margaret. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Away from here," was all he said. As they rode out of Bitter Creek, neither looked back at the town that had brought them together through an act of callous greed. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, holding secrets that would soon test everything they thought they knew about pride, prejudice, and the possibility of redemption. The first light of dawn revealed a landscape that seemed carved from the bones of the earth itself. Red rock formations jutted from the desert floor like ancient sentinels, their surfaces scarred by wind and time. The trail they followed was barely visible, marked only by scattered hoofprints and the occasional bleached skull of a steer. Above them, turkey vultures circled lazily in the thermals, patient as death itself. Margaret O'Brien rode behind Samuel Crowfeather, maintaining a careful distance of 20 feet. Her back ached from the unfamiliar posture of riding astride rather than side saddle. And her hands, accustomed to needlework and washing, were already raw from gripping the reins. She had not spoken since they'd left Bitter Creek 6 hours ago, and neither had he. The sun climbed higher, transforming the desert from a place of shadows and cool air into a furnace. Heat waves shimmered off the rocks, creating mirages that looked like lakes of silver water. Margaret's throat was parched, but she refused to ask for water. She would not give this Apache the satisfaction of seeing her weakness. Samuel rode as if he were part of his paint pony, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the animal's gait. He had not looked back at her once, treating her presence with the same indifference he might show to a pack mule. This should have relieved her. She had feared worse treatment, but instead, it kindled a spark of anger in her chest. She was not cargo to be transported. As they descended into a dry wash, memories began to surface in Margaret's mind like bubbles rising through dark water. She saw another desert, another time. Blood on the sand, screams in the night, the weight of a secret that could destroy her if revealed. She shook her head violently, trying to dislodge the images, and her mare snorted nervously at the sudden movement. This drew Samuel's attention. He reined in his pony and turned in his saddle, studying her with those unreadable dark eyes. "You need water," he said. It was not a question. "I'm fine," Margaret replied, her voice cracking slightly on the words. "Proud words kill in desert," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. He took a water skin from his saddle and walked back to her. "Drink." She wanted to refuse, but her body betrayed her. Her hands shook as she reached for the water skin, and she drank greedily, the warm water tasting like salvation. When she handed it back, their fingers briefly touched, and she jerked away as if burned. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Why waste your gold on winning me?" Samuel's expression didn't change. "Not about you," he said. "Big Jim Thornton sell bad horses to Apache. Cheat my people, take our gold, give us animals that die in one season. This was justice. So I'm what, your revenge against Big Jim?" "You are free of him," Samuel said, turning back to his horse. "That is enough." They continued riding as the sun reached its zenith. The landscape began to change, becoming more broken and treacherous. Tall saguaro cacti stood like green giants, their arms raised in perpetual surrender to the sky. Cholla cactus clustered in the valleys, their segments glowing gold in the light, beautiful and deadly. As they navigated a particularly narrow passage between two rock formations, Margaret's mare suddenly shied, nearly throwing her. She managed to keep her seat, but her heart pounded as she saw what had startled the horse: a rattlesnake, thick as a man's arm, coiled in the shade of a rock. Samuel had already drawn his rifle in one smooth motion, but he didn't shoot. Instead, he dismounted and found a long stick. With careful movements, he encouraged the snake to slither away into the rocks. "No need to kill," he said. "Snake lives here. We are visitors." This unexpected gentleness surprised Margaret. She had heard stories of Apache cruelty, of their savage ways. But this man had shown more restraint than most white men she knew. The contradiction unsettled her. As afternoon wore toward evening, they stopped to rest the horses in the shade of a large outcropping. Samuel handed her dried meat and a kind of flat bread she didn't recognize. They ate in silence, but Margaret found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of harsh beauty that the desert carved into those who survived it. Scars marked his arms and chest where his shirt hung open, some old, some more recent. His hands, she noticed, were gentle with the horses despite their obvious strength. "You speak English well," she ventured. "Mission school," he replied curtly. "Until I was 12. Then soldiers came." His jaw tightened, and he said no more. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the rocks in shades of orange and purple, Margaret made a decision. She stood abruptly and walked toward her horse. "I thank you for freeing me from Big Jim," she said formally. "But I won't be owned by anyone. I'll find my own way from here." She had barely gotten her foot in the stirrup when Samuel's voice stopped her. "You go alone. You die. If not from thirst, then from Comancheros. They patrol these lands, looking for women traveling alone." "That's my choice to make," Margaret said defiantly. "Is it?" Samuel asked. "You know this desert? You know where water is, which plants heal and which ones kill? You know how to read weather in clouds, or find direction by stars?" Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly. He was right, and they both knew it, but her pride wouldn't let her simply acquiesce. "Then teach me," she said. "If I must travel with you, at least let me learn to survive." For the first time, something that might have been surprise flickered across Samuel's features. "White women do not want to learn Apache ways." "I'm not most white women," Margaret said, meeting his gaze steadily. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We make camp soon. First lesson tonight." As they rode on, searching for a suitable campsite, Margaret found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a different woman entirely, living a different life. The weight of her secret pressed against her chest like a physical thing, but she pushed it down. Samuel Crowfeather might own her debt, but he did not own her past. That burden was hers alone to carry. They found a sheltered spot among the rocks as darkness began to fall. A small spring seeped from a crack in the stone, feeding a pool no bigger than a wash basin. Desert willows grew nearby, their pink flowers incongruous in the harsh landscape. As Samuel built a small fire, he began her first lesson. Fire must be small. He explained. "Big fire, everyone sees. Small fire, only we get warm." He showed her how to arrange the stones to reflect heat while hiding the flames. Margaret watched intently, memorizing every detail. When he handed her the flint and steel to try herself, she failed several times before producing a weak spark that caught the tinder. The small victory felt disproportionately important. As they sat by the fire, the desert came alive with the night sounds, the yip of coyotes, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. The stars emerged in numbers that seemed impossible, a river of light across the black sky. "Why are you not afraid?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Most white women would weep, beg, try to run." Margaret stared into the fire, debating how much truth to share. "I've seen worse than being won in a card game," she said finally. "Fear is a luxury I can't afford." Samuel nodded as if this made perfect sense. "You are stronger than you appear. This is good. Weak things do not survive here." "Is that why your people have survived?" Margaret asked. "Because you're strong." "We survive because we know when to bend," Samuel said. "Like willow in storm, white men try to stand rigid like oak. When big wind comes, oak breaks, but willow remains." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Samuel stood and laid out bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. "Sleep now. Tomorrow we reach the mountains. Trail becomes harder." Margaret lay down fully clothed, using her folded coat as a pillow. Despite her exhaustion, sleep seemed impossible. She stared up at the stars, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Across the fire, Samuel's breathing had already deepened into sleep, but she noticed he kept one hand near his rifle as she finally drifted toward slumber. Her last thought was a strange one. For the first time in 6 months, she did not dream of the past. Instead, she dreamed of learning to read the desert's secrets, of becoming someone who could survive in this harsh land. It was a dangerous dream for a woman with secrets, but in the darkness between the rocks, with only the stars as witness, she allowed herself to hope. The mountain trail wound upward like a serpent's spine, each turn revealing new challenges. They had been traveling for 5 days now, and the landscape had transformed from desert floor to pine-covered slopes. The air was thinner here, cooler, scented with resin and the promise of rain. Margaret had surprised herself with her adaptability. Her hands, once soft, now bore calluses from rope and rain. She had learned to read the sky for weather, to spot water signs and the flight patterns of birds. to move quietly through the brush. Samuel had been a patient, if taciturn teacher, correcting her mistakes with few words but clear demonstrations. On this particular morning, she was mending a tear in her riding skirt when Samuel suddenly tensed, his hand moving to his rifle. He held up a hand for silence, then pointed to fresh tracks in the dust. Shod horses, at least 3 riders, moving fast. "Trouble?" she whispered. "Maybe," he replied, studying the marks. "Stay close." They had barely gone another mile when the attack came. 3 men burst from the rocks above, firing wildly. Samuel's paint pony reared as a bullet whistled past, and Margaret fought to control her frightened mare. "The Apache and his white woman," one of the attackers shouted. $50 bounty on his scalp. "Boys!" Samuel had already dismounted, slapping his pony's rump to send it to safety. He pulled Margaret from her saddle and pushed her behind a large boulder. "Stay down," he commanded, then turned to face their attackers. The firefight was brief, but intense. Samuel moved like smoke, using every rock and tree for cover, his shots careful and deliberate. Margaret pressed herself against the boulder, heart hammering, when she noticed a movement to their left, a 4th attacker, creeping along the ridge to flank them. Without thinking, she reached for the small pistol hidden in her coat, a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson she had carried since before. The weight of it was familiar in her hand, comforting even. She waited until the man was in range, then fired twice. He cried out and tumbled down the slope. The remaining attackers, seeing their advantage lost, retreated into the rocks. Samuel pursued them briefly to ensure they were truly gone, then returned to find Margaret still holding the smoking pistol, her face pale but determined. He stared at her for a long moment. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My father taught me," she said, which was partially true. A woman alone needs protection. Samuel retrieved the horses while Margaret checked the fallen attacker. He was dead, a rough-looking man with a week's growth of beard and clothes that marked him as a drifter. Going through his pockets, an action that came too naturally to her, she found a crumpled wanted poster. Her blood ran cold when she saw it wasn't for Samuel. As she'd assumed, it was for someone else entirely, someone from her past. She quickly stuffed the poster into her coat as Samuel returned. He had a graze on his left arm, blood seeping through his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, grateful for the distraction. "Nothing," he dismissed, but she insisted on examining the wound, as she cleaned and bandaged his arm with supplies from his saddlebags. She was acutely aware of his scrutiny. This was the closest they had been since that first night, and she could feel the questions radiating from him like heat from a fire. "Most white women would have hidden," he said finally, or screamed. "You shot to kill?" "Most white women haven't lived my life," Margaret replied, tying off the bandage perhaps tighter than necessary. They rode in silence after that, both lost in thought. As afternoon approached, they came upon a sight that made Margaret's breath catch, a burned homestead, probably abandoned for a year or more. The charred remains of a cabin stood like black bones against the green forest. A child's doll lay in the yard, weathered by rain and sun. "Apache?" she asked, though she immediately regretted the assumption. Samuel dismounted and examined the scene with practiced eyes. "No, white men did this. See the shell casings? Army rifles? The way the fire was set, systematic, meant to leave nothing." His voice was flat, but she heard the anger underneath. They made camp early that day, neither wanting to linger near the destroyed home. As Margaret gathered firewood, another skill she'd acquired, she noticed Samuel watching her with an expression she couldn't read. That night, as they sat by their small fire, he broke their usual silence. "My village was burned like that homestead. I was 14. Soldiers came at dawn, said we were harboring hostiles. We were farmers, growing corn and beans. My mother, my sisters—" He stopped, staring into the flames. Margaret felt an unexpected ache in her chest. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Your people always say sorry after," he said bitterly. "Never before. They're not my people," Margaret said before she could stop herself. Samuel looked at her sharply. You are white. They are white. How are they not your people?" She met his gaze steadily. "Being born with the same color skin doesn't make someone your people. Actions do, choices do." "And what choices have you made?" "Margaret O'Brien." It was the first time he had used her name. She looked away. "Ones I have to live with." The following day brought new challenges. They encountered a section of trail washed out by spring floods, forcing them to find an alternate route. Margaret surprised herself again by suggesting a path she'd noticed, reading the lay of the land as Samuel had taught her. He followed her suggestion without comment, which she took as approval. As they navigated the treacherous detour, leading their horses on foot, Margaret's mare suddenly slipped on loose shale. The animal's frightened whinny pierced the air as it slid toward a steep drop. Without hesitation, Margaret lunged forward, grabbing the reins with both hands and throwing her full weight backward. For a terrifying moment, she thought they would both go over the edge. Then Samuel was there, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, adding his strength to hers. Together they hauled the mare back to safety. They stood there for a moment, both breathing hard, his arms still around her. Margaret was acutely aware of his warmth, the solid strength of him. Then, as if burned, they stepped apart simultaneously. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded, checking the mare for injuries. "You risked yourself for a horse." "She's a good horse," Margaret said defensively. "And I don't abandon those who depend on me." "No," Samuel said slowly. "I am beginning to see that you don't." That evening, they reached a beautiful spot, a hidden valley with a clear stream running through it, surrounded by aspens that whispered in the wind. Samuel declared they would rest here for a day to recover from their ordeal. As Margaret bathed in the stream modestly, fully clothed but grateful to wash away days of trail dust, she thought about how much had changed. The woman who had entered Murphy's saloon a week ago seemed like a stranger now. That woman had been running from her past, hiding behind widow's weeds and silence. This woman. She wasn't sure who this woman was becoming. When she returned to camp, she found Samuel working on something, a pair of moccasins. She realized, sized for her feet. "Boots are no good for mountain trails," he explained without looking up. "These will serve you better." She accepted them with genuine gratitude, touched by the unexpected kindness. As she tried them on, they fit perfectly, she said. "I misjudged you. When you won me in that card game, I thought—" "You thought Apache Savage would take what he won?" Samuel's voice was neutral, but she heard the hurt underneath. "Yes," she admitted. "I'm sorry for that too." He finally looked at her. "We all carry the prejudices we are taught. The question is whether we can see past them." As darkness fell over the valley, they sat by the fire in more comfortable silence than before. Margaret found herself stealing glances at him, seeing not the Apache but Samuel Crowfeather, a man who had lost everything, who had every reason to hate her kind, yet who made her moccasins and taught her to survive. "Tomorrow we reach the high passes," he said. "After that, 2 days to the valley where my mother's people have a camp. You can stay there if you wish, or I can take you to the nearest town." The thought of parting ways sent an unexpected pang through her. "And if I don't want either option?" He looked at her in surprise. "What else is there?" She didn't have an answer for that. Not yet, but as she lay in her bedroll that night, listening to the aspens whisper secrets to the stars, she knew that something fundamental had shifted. The careful walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure if that terrified or thrilled her more. In the darkness, she heard Samuel shift in his bedroll. "Margaret," he said quietly, "the man today you have killed before." It wasn't a question. She closed her eyes, seeing faces she wished she could forget. "Yes," she whispered. "To survive?" "To survive." "Then we understand each other," he said, and spoke no more. As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret realized that perhaps they did understand each other, in ways that went beyond words or explanations. Two damaged souls, cast together by chance and circumstance, finding in each other an unexpected recognition. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. And in this harsh land where survival was never certain, something was better than nothing. The high pass stretched before them like a gateway to another world, windswept and barren above the tree line. They had been climbing since dawn, and now, as the sun reached its zenith, they could see for miles in every direction. The vastness of it all made Margaret feel simultaneously insignificant and wildly alive. Samuel had been different these past 2 days, more watchful, more tense. She understood why when they descended into a small valley and she saw the town of Cedar Ridge spread before them. It was larger than Bitter Creek, with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings and a church steeple piercing the sky like an accusatory finger. "We need supplies," Samuel explained, though his reluctance was evident. "Stay close. Speak to no one." As they rode down the dusty main street, Margaret felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Women pulled their children closer. Men's hands drifted toward their weapons. The sight of an Apache riding freely through town with a white woman was clearly not common. They stopped at the general store, and Samuel dismounted. "Wait here," he instructed. But Margaret slid from her saddle. "Where you go, I go," she said firmly. "We're together in this." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. They entered the store side by side. The proprietor, a thin man with nervous hands, watched them suspiciously. "We don't serve Indians here," he announced. "You serve gold?" Samuel asked, placing coins on the counter. The man's greed warred with his prejudice. Greed won. "What do you need?" As they gathered supplies, flour, salt, ammunition, coffee, Margaret became aware of whispered conversations around them. Her blood chilled when she caught fragments. "Saw the poster. Matches the description. Reward money." She moved closer to Samuel, pretending to examine a bolt of fabric. "We need to leave. Now." He nodded slightly, completing their purchases with swift efficiency. But as they turned to go, their path was blocked by 3 men. The one in front wore a sheriff's star. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his eyes never leaving Samuel. "Are you all right? Is this savage holding you against your will?" "I'm fine," Margaret replied coolly. "This man is my guide, hired fairly." "That's so?" The sheriff's gaze shifted to her, and she saw recognition dawn in his eyes. "You wouldn't be Margaret O'Brien from Bitter Creek, would you? We got word about a woman matching your description. Some folks are mighty interested in finding her." Margaret's hand instinctively moved toward her hidden pistol, but Samuel stepped forward. "The lady hired me. We have business in the mountains. No law against that." "Maybe not," the sheriff said. "But I think we need to have a conversation. Both of you, down at my office." The tension in the store was thick enough to cut. Margaret could see Samuel calculating odds, measuring distances. She knew he could probably fight their way out. But at what cost? And if they ran now, it would only confirm suspicions. "Of course, Sheriff," she said suddenly, her voice adopting a cultured tone she hadn't used in months. "Though I must say, I'm surprised at this treatment. My late husband's family in San Francisco will be most distressed to hear how I've been accosted while conducting legitimate business." The sheriff hesitated. San Francisco meant money, influence, lawyers. "Now, ma'am, nobody's accosting anyone." "Aren't they?" Margaret drew herself up to her full height, every inch the affronted lady. "I hire a guide to take me through the mountains to settle my husband's affairs, and I'm treated like a criminal? Perhaps I should wire my attorney, Mr. Theodore Blackwood. You may have heard of him. He handled the Southern Pacific Railroad case last year." It was a bluff, built on fragments of overheard conversations and newspaper stories, but it worked. The sheriff's confidence wavered. "No need for lawyers, ma'am, but you understand. We have to be careful. There's been talk of a woman, a dangerous woman, in these parts." "How fascinating," Margaret said dryly. "Well, as you can see, I'm merely a widow attempting to navigate the complexities of frontier life. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have miles to travel before dark." She swept past the sheriff with imperial dignity, Samuel following. They mounted their horses and rode out of town at a measured pace, though Margaret's heart was racing. Only when Cedar Ridge was well behind them did she allow herself to breathe properly. "San Francisco lawyers?" Samuel asked, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "A useful fiction," she admitted. "Though not entirely false, I did know of Mr. Blackwood. He defended a woman I knew once." They rode in silence for a while, following a trail that wound through stands of ponderosa pine. Finally, Samuel spoke again. "The sheriff knew you, not just description. He recognized something." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Yes." "This dangerous woman they seek. Is she you?" She considered lying, but found she couldn't. "Not to him. I was someone else once. That woman is dead. But her past follows you." "Yes." Samuel nodded as if this made perfect sense. "The dead do not always stay buried. My people know this." That evening, they made camp by a small lake, its surface mirror-smooth in the twilight. As Margaret tended the fire, she'd become quite proficient at it. Samuel surprised her by producing 2 fishing lines from his pack. "You fish?" she asked. "When I can. Quiet food, no gunshots to bring curious ears." They sat on a fallen log by the water's edge, lines cast, waiting in companionable silence. The sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. And for a moment, Margaret could almost forget the danger following them. "Why didn't you run?" Samuel asked suddenly. "In the store. You could have claimed I kidnapped you. They would have believed it." "Sss." Margaret watched ripples spread where a fish had surfaced. "Because it would have been a lie, and because—" She paused, searching for words. "Because you've shown me more honor in a week than most men have in my lifetime. I won't repay that with betrayal." Samuel's float dipped, and he smoothly set the hook, pulling in a decent-sized trout. As he cleaned it with practiced efficiency, he said, "You speak of honor, but you also speak of a past that haunts you. How do these things live together?" It was the opening she had both dreaded and hoped for. "My husband, my real husband, not the story I told in Bitter Creek, was not a good man. He was cruel, to me, to others. He wore a badge, but he used it to hurt people. Your people, especially." Samuel's hand stilled on the fish. "Go on." "One night, he came home drunk, boasting about what he'd done to an Apache family who wouldn't leave their land. A family with children." Her voice broke slightly. I wouldn't let him continue, so I stopped him permanently." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Finally," Samuel said. "The law does not forgive a woman who kills her husband, even a bad one." "No, it doesn't. So I ran, changed my name, became a widow of a different sort." She laughed bitterly. "I thought I could disappear in Bitter Creek, but nowhere is far enough when there's a price on your head." Samuel finished cleaning the fish and stood. "Margaret O'Brien," he said formally, "or whoever you were before, you killed a man who hurt my people. For this, you have my respect and my protection, for what it is worth." Tears she hadn't expected stung her eyes. "You don't even know the whole truth." "I know enough," he said simply. "Come, we eat, then I teach you to fish properly. Useful skill for a woman with dangerous past." As they prepared their meal, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. The weight of her secret, carried alone for so long, seemed lighter now that it was shared. She watched Samuel move around their camp with quiet efficiency. This man who had every reason to hate her kind, but who offered protection instead of judgment. After they ate, true to his word, he taught her the finer points of fishing, how to read the water for likely spots, how to tie different knots for different purposes, how to wait with patience for the right moment to strike. As darkness fell and stars began to appear, they caught 3 more fish, which they cleaned and wrapped in leaves for tomorrow's meal. "Samuel," she said as they banked the fire for the night, "what will you tell your mother's people about me?" He considered this. "The truth, that you are a woman who seeks a new path, that you have proven yourself on the trail, that you can be trusted. And if they don't accept me, then we go elsewhere." The simple certainty in his voice made her throat tight. "We?" she asked softly. He looked at her across the dying fire, his dark eyes reflecting the embers. "You save my life, I save yours. This is how it works. Besides," a rare smile touched his lips, "you still have much to learn. Cannot catch proper fish yet." Despite everything, the danger behind them, the uncertainty ahead, Margaret found herself smiling back. "Then I suppose you'll have to keep teaching me." "I suppose I will." As she lay in her bedroll that night, listening to the loons calling across the lake, Margaret reflected on the strange turns of fate. A week ago, she had been alone, running from a past that seemed determined to catch her. Now, she had found an unexpected ally in the last person she would have imagined. More than an ally, perhaps, though she didn't dare name it yet. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, but for the first time in months, Margaret didn't feel small beneath their gaze. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But tonight, she was not alone, and that, she realized, made all the difference. The cavalry patrol appeared on the ridge just after dawn, their blue uniforms dark against the lightening sky. Margaret counted 12 riders, moving in formation down the narrow canyon trail that she and Samuel had planned to take. From their concealed position behind a cluster of boulders, she could see the determined set of their faces, the way they rode with purpose rather than routine patrol. "They hunt someone," Samuel whispered, his body tense beside hers. "Us, perhaps." Margaret's mind raced. The sheriff in Cedar Ridge must have telegraphed ahead, or perhaps word of their presence had traveled faster than they'd anticipated. She studied the soldier's path, remembering something from years ago. Her husband had once drunkenly boasted about cavalry tactics, about how they always followed established trails because of their horses and equipment. "The old mining road," she said suddenly, "through Devil's Backbone. I saw it on a map once. It's treacherous, abandoned, but it parallels this canyon." Samuel looked at her with surprise. "You know this path." "I know of it. My husband mentioned it. Said only fools and Apache would use it." She met his eyes. "Good thing we're both." Then, a flash of approval crossed his face. "Show me." They backtracked carefully, leading their horses on foot to avoid raising dust. Margaret's memory proved accurate. They found the old road, barely more than a goat track carved into the cliff face. Years of erosion had narrowed it in places to barely 3 feet wide, with a sheer drop on one side that made her stomach clench. "Can the horses make it?" she asked. Samuel studied the path with experienced eyes. "If we lead them, if they trust us." He looked at her meaningfully. "Do you trust me, Margaret?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, surprising herself with the truth of it. They began the treacherous journey, Samuel leading his paint pony, Margaret following with her mare. The path wound along the cliff face like a snake, sometimes climbing, sometimes descending, always precarious. Loose rocks skittered over the edge, taking heart-stopping seconds to hit the bottom. Halfway along, Margaret's mare suddenly balked, eyes rolling white with fear. The animal's hooves scrambled on the loose shale, and for a terrifying moment, Margaret thought they would both go over. "Easy, girl, easy," she crooned, fighting her own panic. She pressed herself against the cliff face, using her body to steady the horse. "That's it, just a bit further." Samuel had stopped ahead, ready to help, but Margaret managed to calm the mare and continue. When they reached a slightly wider section, he nodded approvingly. "You have steady nerves. Fear later," she managed. "Survive now." It took them 4 hours to traverse what would have been a 2-hour journey on the main trail. By the time they reached the other side, Both humans and horses were exhausted, but they had successfully bypassed the cavalry patrol. As they rested in the shade of some cottonwoods, Samuel pulled out his field glasses and studied their back trail. They searched the main canyon still. Your memory served us well. My past finally good for something, Margaret said dryly. They pushed on through the afternoon, following game trails and creek beds, always staying off the main routes. As evening approached, they came upon an abandoned prospector's cabin, its roof partially collapsed, but walls still solid. We rest here tonight, Samuel decided. Horses need proper rest after today. As they explored the cabin, Margaret found remnants of its former occupant, rusted mining tools, a few moldy books, a faded photograph of a woman and child. She wondered what had happened to the prospector, whether he'd struck it rich or died chasing dreams of gold. While Samuel tended the horses, Margaret managed to make the cabin somewhat habitable, clearing debris and laying out their bedrolls. She found an old coffee pot, miraculously intact, and soon had coffee brewing over a small fire. "Smells like civilization," Samuel commented, accepting a cup gratefully. "Strange how the little things matter." Margaret agreed. "A week ago, I wouldn't have thought twice about coffee. Now it feels like luxury." They sat in the doorway of the cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. The quiet between them had changed over the days, becoming comfortable rather than tense. Margaret found herself studying his profile in the fading light, the strong lines of his face, the way his hair caught the last rays of sun. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have left me in any town by now, collected whatever you felt I owed, and been free of this trouble." Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Finally," he said, "my grandmother once told me a story about a warrior who found an eagle with broken wing. Other warriors said kill it, take feathers for honor. But this warrior, he mended the wing, fed the eagle until it could fly. The eagle flew away, and the warriors mocked him for wasting time. What happened? Years later, the warrior was wounded, dying alone in the desert. Eagles came, dozens of them. They brought him water in their beaks, dropped rabbits for food, spread their wings to give him shade. He survived because of kindness given without expectation of return." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Am I the eagle in this story? Perhaps we both are," Samuel said softly, both with broken wings, trying to remember how to fly. The moment stretched between them, fragile and profound. Then, from the darkness beyond the cabin, came the sound of horses, many horses moving fast. Samuel was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Margaret grabbed her pistol, heart pounding. They waited, tense, as the sound grew closer. Then, to their relief, the horses passed by on a trail below them, the riders apparently unaware of the cabin's existence. "Close," Margaret breathed. "Too close," Samuel agreed. "At first light, we leave the trails entirely. Go overland to the sacred mountains. My people have hidden paths there, old ways that soldiers never find. Sacred mountains, where my ancestors walked to speak with spirits, where Apache boys become men, where—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Where outsiders do not go, but you are not outsider anymore, not to me." The weight of this admission hung between them. Margaret understood the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just safety, but acceptance into places holy to his people. "I'm honored," she said simply, "and I swear I'll respect what you share with me." He nodded, satisfied. "We should sleep. Tomorrow will test us both." But sleep proved elusive. Margaret lay in her bedroll, hyper-aware of every sound. The cabin felt both safe and confining, a temporary shelter in a world that seemed determined to hunt them down. She thought of the soldiers, probably camped now, planning their next sweep. Thought of the sheriff in Cedar Ridge, counting potential reward money. Thought of all the people who would see her and Samuel as wrong, unnatural, criminal. "You do not sleep," Samuel's voice came from the darkness. "Too many thoughts," she admitted. "Share them. Thoughts weigh less when carried by two." She smiled at the wisdom. I was thinking about how the world sees us, a white woman and an Apache man. To them, we're everything that's wrong, everything that threatens their neat little boundaries. Their world is built on fear, Samuel said. Fear of difference, fear of change. My people learned this too late. Do you hate them for it? White people. I did. For a long time after my family died, hate was all I had. It kept me warm at night, gave me reason to wake each day. But hate is like drinking poison and hoping enemy dies. It was killing me slowly. What changed? I met a white man, a priest at the mission, Father Miguel, though he was Irish, not Mexican. He found me nearly dead after a fight, nursed me back to health. Never asked for anything, never tried to convert me, just showed kindness. He said something I never forgot. The color of a man's heart matters more than the color of his skin. Margaret absorbed this. He sounds wise. Soldiers killed him 2 years later. Said he was helping Apache raiders. He was actually teaching Apache children to read. The bitterness in Samuel's voice was sharp, but controlled. I'm sorry, Margaret said, knowing how inadequate the words were. His death taught me final lesson. Samuel continued, that good people exist in all colors, and so do evil ones. The choice is not about blood or birth. It's about who we decide to be. They lay in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered, the eternal conversation of predator and prey. Margaret thought, though she was no longer sure which they were, just before she finally drifted off to sleep. She heard Samuel speak once more, so softly she might have imagined it. You asked why I help you. Truth is, Margaret O'Brien, somewhere on this trail. You stopped being obligation and became choice. My choice. She wanted to respond, to tell him that he had become her choice too. But sleep finally claimed her. In her dreams, she flew with eagles over sacred mountains, free from pursuit, free from the past, free to be nothing more or less than herself. It was a dangerous dream, but in the darkness of the abandoned cabin, with Samuel keeping watch nearby, she allowed herself to believe it might someday be possible. The sacred mountains rose before them like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. They had been climbing for 2 days through increasingly wild terrain, following paths that seemed to exist more in Samuel's memory than in physical reality. Now, as they paused at a narrow gorge, Margaret sensed they were approaching something significant. From here, we go where my people have walked for generations, Samuel said, his voice carrying a reverence she hadn't heard before. You must understand, what I show you, no white person has seen and lived to tell. The weight of his trust settled on her shoulders like a mantle. I understand, she said quietly. They descended into the gorge, following a stream that tumbled over smooth rocks. The walls closed in, creating a twilight world of ferns and moss. Then, suddenly, they emerged into a hidden valley that took Margaret's breath away. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches creating a green cathedral. Petroglyphs covered the cliff faces, spirals, animals, human figures with arms raised to the sky. Beautiful, Margaret whispered. Samuel dismounted and stood silently for a moment, his head bowed. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with memory. My grandfather brought me here when I was 7. Said this place remembers when the world was young. They made camp near a natural spring, the water so clear Margaret could count the pebbles at the bottom. As she helped unsaddle the horses, she noticed Samuel's tension had returned. Different from before, not the wariness of the hunted, but something deeper. That evening, as they sat by their small fire, he began to speak unprompted. You asked about my past, my family, here, in this place. I can tell you. Margaret remained silent, understanding this was a gift as precious as the hidden valley itself. My father was not Apache, Samuel began. He was Mexican, a trader who fell in love with my mother. Their union angered both families, but they didn't care. They built a life between 2 worlds. He smiled sadly. I was named Samuel by my father. Crow feather by my mother's people. Never fully either. Always both. That must have been difficult, Margaret said softly. Yes, but also rich. I learned to see from two perspectives, speak in two languages, walk in two worlds. My father taught me to read, write, figure numbers. My mother's brothers taught me to hunt, track, survive. I thought I could bridge both worlds. His voice hardened. I was young, foolish. He stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the firelight. Margaret waited, patient now in the way the desert had taught her. When the soldiers came to our village, I tried to talk to them. Thought my education, my English, would help. The captain seemed reasonable. He said if we moved to the reservation peacefully, no one would be hurt. Samuel's hands clenched. I translated for my people, convinced them to trust. 3 days later, the soldiers returned, said we were hiding weapons. They searched, found nothing, but it didn't matter. They had orders. Margaret's heart ached at the pain in his voice. She rose and moved closer, not touching, just being present. My mother tried to protect my sisters. They shot her for resisting. My father ran to her, and they shot him too. I watched them die, unable to move, unable to help. The captain, the same one who promised safety, he looked at me and said, "This is what comes of mixing blood. Boy, you're neither one thing nor the other, and that makes you nothing." "Samuel," Margaret breathed, reaching out instinctively. He turned to her, his face ravaged by memory. 47 people died that day. Men, women, children. Because I believed. Because I translated lies. "It wasn't your fault," Margaret said firmly. "You tried to save them. The soldiers would have attacked regardless." Would they, or did my presence, my mixed blood, give them the excuse they wanted? He shook his head. For years, I've carried this, the proud Apache who won the widow in a game. He's a fraud, a half-breed who belongs nowhere, who failed everyone who mattered. Margaret stepped forward and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Listen to me, Samuel Crowfeather. You are not nothing. You are not a fraud. You are a man who survived unbearable loss and still shows kindness, who shares sacred places with a woman who should be your enemy, who sees beyond blood and birth to the person beneath. As do you," he said roughly. "You killed your husband to stop him hurting my people. Do you know what that means? A white woman risking everything for Apache lives? It means I'm human," Margaret said simply. "As are you." For a long moment, they stood there, her hands on his face, their eyes locked. Then Samuel pulled back gently. "I need to show you something," he said. He led her to a flat rock near the spring, where moonlight illuminated more petroglyphs. These were different, newer, clearly made with metal tools rather than stone. As her eyes adjusted, she gasped. It was a scene depicting soldiers attacking a village, and at the center, a figure stood between two groups, arms outstretched as if trying to stop the violence. "I carved this," Samuel admitted. "Came here after the massacre, half dead from wandering, wanting to die. But this place, it wouldn't let me. The old spirits whispered that my story wasn't finished." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now I think they were right." He turned to her. "Your turn. Tell me about your husband. Tell me what happened that night." Margaret had known this moment would come. Here, in this sacred place where truth seemed the only currency that mattered. She couldn't hide anymore. "His name was Lieutenant James Morrison," she began. "I was 17 when we married, desperate to escape my father's house. James seemed charming, ambitious. It wasn't until after the wedding that I learned his true nature." She moved to sit on a nearby rock, Samuel following. He was stationed at Fort Grant. His job was to manage the local tribes. He took pleasure in it, the power, the cruelty. He would come home and brag about burning crops, poisoning wells, worse things. When I protested, he'd remind me that a wife's duty was obedience. "But you didn't obey," Samuel said. "I tried. God help me. For 3 years I tried. But that night," she closed her eyes, remembering. "He came home drunk, blood on his uniform. Said he'd found an Apache family hiding in a canyon, a mother, father, 3 children. He described what he did to them before the end. Laughed about it. Tears ran down her face now, but she continued. Something broke in me while he slept. I took his service revolver. 1 shot, clean. I packed what I could carry and ran. Changed my name, my story. Kept running until you. The woman they seek, she's not Margaret O'Brien. Catherine Morrison died that night along with her husband. Margaret said, I became Margaret O'Brien, widow of a rancher, harmless and forgettable. Except someone remembered. Someone always remembers. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he stood and walked to his saddlebags, returning with something wrapped in deer hide. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a beautiful necklace, turquoise and silver, old and precious. This was my mother's, he said. Hidden before the soldiers came. I retrieved it later, kept it, though I never knew why. Now I do. He held it out to her. Catherine Morrison is dead. Margaret O'Brien was fiction. But the woman who sits here, who trusted me with truth, she needs a new name, an Apache name. For the Apache she saved with her courage. Margaret's hands trembled as she took the necklace. What name? Braveheart woman, he said in Apache, then translated, for that is what you are. As he fastened the necklace around her throat, Margaret felt something fundamental shift. The weight of her past didn't disappear, but it transformed, becoming not a burden but a bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. Samuel, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I need to tell you something else. These feelings I have, they're not gratitude or dependence. He placed a finger gently on her lips. I know, he said simply. But here, in this sacred place, we speak only truth. And the truth is, when this journey ends, you will have choices. You could go east, where no one knows you. You could find a new town, a new life. You should know all paths before you choose. And if I choose you, she asked boldly, then we face the world together, outcast and half-breed, hunted and haunted, but together. His hand cupped her face. But choose with clear eyes, brave heart woman. My path is not easy. Neither was mine. She reminded him, but walking it alone nearly killed me. Perhaps 2 broken wings together can remember how to fly. He smiled then, the first full smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face. My grandmother would have liked you, he said. They returned to the fire, sitting closer now, the weight of shared truths creating a new bond between them. Tomorrow they would leave the sacred valley, return to a world that would never understand what they were becoming to each other. But tonight, under stars that had witnessed countless stories of loss and love, they allowed themselves to simply be, not Apache or white, not hunted or hunter, just 2 souls finding light in the darkness. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after they'd left the sacred mountains. Margaret woke to the sound of Samuel's sharp intake of breath, followed by the distinctive click of multiple rifles being cocked. Through the pre-dawn gloom, she could see them. 5 men positioned strategically around their camp, weapons trained on them. Well, drawled a voice she recognized with sinking dread. The Apache and his white woman. That's $1,000 standing up right there. The speaker stepped into view. Jack Thorpe, a bounty hunter she'd seen in Bitter Creek. His scarred face split into an ugly grin as he kept his rifle trained on Samuel. Mrs. Morrison, or should I say, the widow Morrison. There's plenty of folks back in Arizona territory who want a word with you about your late husband. Let her go, Samuel said calmly, though Margaret could see the tension in every line of his body. Your quarrel is with me. Thorpe laughed. Nice try, Apache, but she's worth more than you. $500 for the murderous widow. Another $500 if we bring her back breathing. You? He shrugged. $50 for an Apache scalp, but I might just kill you for free. The other men chuckled. Evil sounds in the morning stillness. Margaret's mind raced. calculating distances, angles, possibilities. Her pistol was in her coat, too far to reach, but there was something else. "You going to come quiet like, woman?" Thorpe asked. "Or do my boys need to convince you?" "I'll come," Margaret said, standing slowly. As she rose, she caught Samuel's eye, hoping he could read her intention. His almost imperceptible nod told her he understood. She took a step toward Thorpe, then pretended to stumble on a rock. As she fell forward, she grabbed a handful of dirt and ashes from the fire's edge, flinging it into Thorpe's face. "Now!" she shouted. Samuel moved like lightning, rolling behind a boulder as gunfire erupted. Margaret dove for her coat, yanking out her pistol and firing at the nearest attacker. He cried out and dropped his rifle, clutching his shoulder. The camp became chaos. Bullets whined off rocks. Men shouted. Horses screamed and pulled at their tethers. Margaret pressed herself behind a fallen log, exchanging fire with two of the bounty hunters who had taken cover in the rocks above. She could hear Samuel's rifle speaking in measured intervals. One shot, one target. An Apache warrior didn't waste ammunition. A man screamed and tumbled from his perch in the rocks. "Damn you!" Thorpe roared, firing wildly in Samuel's direction. It's just one Apache and a woman. But it wasn't just any Apache, and Margaret was no ordinary woman. They fought with the desperate efficiency of those who had everything to lose. Another bounty hunter tried to flank Margaret's position. She waited until he was committed to his move, then shot him in the leg. He fell, howling. The battle might have lasted minutes or hours. Time lost meaning in the fury of combat. When the gunfire finally stuttered to a halt, 3 of the attackers were down. Thorpe and one other had retreated to higher ground, still firing sporadically. "You okay?" Samuel called out. "Yes," Margaret responded, checking her ammunition. 2 bullets left. "You?" "Shoulders grazed. Nothing serious." He paused. "They'll try to wait us out. We need to move." But Thorpe had other plans. "Listen up," he shouted. "We got more men coming. Telegraph went out from Cedar Ridge 2 days ago. By noon. There'll be a whole posse here. Soldiers, too. You can't run forever." Margaret's heart sank. If he was telling the truth, and she suspected he was, their time was running out. She looked across at Samuel, saw the same realization in his eyes. "There is another way," Samuel called back. "Single combat. You and me, Thorpe. Winner takes all." "Samuel, no," Margaret whispered urgently. Thorpe laughed. "Why would I fight an Apache savage when I can wait for backup?" "Because you're a coward," Samuel said simply. "Hiding behind numbers, behind guns, no honor. Your men know it. Everyone will know it." The insult hit home. Margaret could see Thorpe's face redden even from her position. "I ain't no coward." "Prove it," Samuel challenged. "Unless you're afraid of one savage." There was a long pause. Then Thorpe stood up. "Knives," he said. "To the death." Samuel emerged from cover, and Margaret's protest died on her lips at the look in his eyes. This was his choice, his fight. She could only watch as the 2 men moved to a clear area between the rocks. Thorpe was bigger, heavier, with the reach advantage. But Samuel moved with deadly grace, his knife an extension of his arm. They circled each other, testing, feinting. Thorpe lunged first, a powerful thrust that would have gutted a slower man. Samuel twisted away, his blade leaving a red line across Thorpe's ribs. The bounty hunter snarled and attacked again, using his weight to try to overwhelm. They grappled, each trying to control the other's knife hand. For a terrifying moment, Thorpe's blade inched toward Samuel's throat. Then Samuel did something unexpected. He let go of his own knife and grabbed Thorpe's wrist with both hands. Using the man's momentum against him, they rolled. And when they came up, Thorpe's own knife was buried in his chest. The bounty hunter stared at the blade in shock, then toppled backward. His remaining companion took one look and fled, scrambling up the rocks and disappearing over the ridge. Samuel stood slowly, breathing hard. Blood ran down his arm from more than just the bullet graze now. Thorpe had marked him several times in their struggle. Margaret ran to him. tearing strips from her petticoat to bind his wounds. "We need to go," he said urgently. "The survivor will bring others." They broke camp with desperate efficiency, saddling horses with hands that shook from adrenaline. As they prepared to ride out, Margaret went through Thorpe's pockets, finding what she feared, a wanted poster with her real name and a fair sketch of her face. But there was something else. Too, a telegraph form. "Samuel," she said, reading quickly. "This says the Army garrison at Fort Benson is sending a patrol. 20 men. They'll be here by—" She looked at the sun's position. "By midday at the latest. Then we ride hard," Samuel said, though she could see the pain in his eyes. The fight had cost him more than he was admitting. They pushed their horses as fast as they dared, following a dry riverbed that would hide their tracks. But Margaret could see Samuel swaying in his saddle, his shirt dark with blood despite her bandages. "We need to stop," she said firmly. "No time." "You'll bleed to death before we escape anyone," she countered. "What good does that do?" he conceded with a nod. And they found shelter in a cluster of cottonwoods. Margaret worked quickly, properly cleaning and dressing his wounds. The knife cuts were deep but clean. With care, they would heal. "You fought for me," she said softly as she worked. "You fought for yourself," he corrected. "I just helped, as you helped me." She finished the last bandage and sat back on her heels. "What do we do now? They know where we're heading. They'll cut us off from the mountains, from your people." Samuel was quiet for a moment, then said, "There is one place they won't expect, one place they fear to go." "Where?" "The Badlands. Desert so harsh even Apache avoid it. But I know a way through. Hidden water, secret paths. My grandfather showed me when I was young, testing me." He met her eyes. "It will be the hardest thing you've ever done. We might not survive. We might not survive if we don't try," Margaret pointed out. "And I'd rather die free in the desert than hang for being a woman who fought back." He smiled grimly. "Braveheart woman indeed. Then we go. But first," he pulled her close, his hand cupping her face. "If we die in the Badlands, you should know, meeting you has been the only good thing in my life for many years. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for that." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "Samuel Crowfeather, you're not allowed to talk like we're already dead. We're going to make it through that desert. We're going to find a place where no one knows our names or our pasts, and we're going to live. Do you hear me? We're going to live." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate and full of promises that might never be kept. When they broke apart, his eyes held new determination. "Yes," he said simply, "we will live." They mounted up again, turning their horses toward the shimmering heat of the Badlands. Behind them, dust on the horizon marked the approaching cavalry. Ahead lay miles of killing desert, where water was myth and shade was memory. But they rode forward anyway. Two outcasts bound by love and desperation, carrying between them the wild hope that somewhere beyond the wasteland lay a future worth the terrible price of reaching it. The sun climbed higher, brutal and unforgiving, as they disappeared into the heat-warped distance, leaving behind only hoofprints that the wind would soon erase. In her heart, Margaret repeated the name he had given her, Brave Heart Woman. She would need every ounce of that bravery now. But with Samuel beside her, wounded but unbroken, she found she could face even the Badlands. They would survive this too, or they would die together. Either way, they would be free. The Badlands had earned their name. For 3 days, Margaret and Samuel struggled through a landscape that seemed designed by demons, alkali flats that burned the eyes, arroyos that led nowhere, heat that shimmered off the ground in waves of pure torment. Their water was nearly gone, carefully rationed to mere sips that did nothing to ease parched throats. Samuel's wounds had reopened during the hard riding, and infection threatened. Margaret had used the last of her torn petticoats for bandages, but she could see the fever beginning to claim him. He swayed in his saddle, muttering sometimes in Apache, sometimes in English, conversations with ghosts only he could see. On the 4th day, their horses began to fail. Samuel's paint pony, loyal to the end, simply stopped and stood with hanging head, sides heaving. They were forced to continue on foot, leading Margaret's mare, carrying only what water remained and their weapons. "Leave me," Samuel said during one of his lucid moments. "Take the horse. Ride north. You can make it." "We've had this conversation," Margaret said firmly, supporting his weight as they stumbled forward. "I don't abandon those I love." Love. The word hung between them in the burning air, acknowledged at last. Samuel's fevered eyes focused on her face. "Stubborn woman," he whispered. "You knew that when you won me in a card game," she replied, trying for lightness despite their desperate situation. As the sun reached its merciless peak, Margaret spotted something that made her heart leap, a slight depression in the rocks ahead, the kind that might mean shade, might mean water. She half-dragged Samuel toward it, praying she wasn't chasing another mirage. It was no mirage. The depression led to a narrow canyon, and, at its end, a miracle. A small spring seeping from the rock, feeding a pool of precious water. Desert willows provided blessed shade. They had found one of Samuel's grandfather's secret places. Margaret eased Samuel down beside the spring and immediately set about tending his wounds. The water was warm but clean, and she used it liberally, washing away the dirt and infection. He was burning with fever now, lost in delirium. "Mother," he called out in Apache. "I'm sorry. I tried to save them. I tried—" "Shh," Margaret soothed, bathing his face with cool water. "Rest now. You're safe." For 2 days, she nursed him in that hidden oasis. She found edible plants Samuel had taught her to recognize, caught small lizards for meat, kept his fever at bay with constant attention. At night, coyotes called from the rim of the canyon, but she kept the fire burning, kept her pistol close, kept faith that he would survive. On the 3rd morning, Samuel's eyes opened clear and focused. "Margaret?" he whispered. "I'm here," she said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "The spring! Grandfather's spring! You found it!" "You found it," she corrected. "You led us here, even burning with fever. Your spirit knew the way." He reached up weakly to touch her face. "My brave heart, woman, stronger than the desert itself." As Samuel recovered his strength over the following days, they made the oasis their temporary home. The spring provided water, the canyon shelter, and for the first time since leaving Bitter Creek, they felt truly safe. No posse would find them here. The Badlands had swallowed too many searchers for anyone to pursue them this deep. One evening, as they sat watching the stars emerge above the canyon walls, Samuel spoke of the future. "North of here, beyond the Badlands, there's a valley. Good water, game, far from any town, a place where people go to disappear. People like us? All kinds. Mexican revolutionaries, former slaves, Chinese railroad workers. Anyone who doesn't fit in the world's neat categories. They mind their own business, help each other when needed, ask no questions about the past." Margaret considered this. "It sounds like a dream." "It's real. I've been there once, trading horses. They'd accept us." He paused. "We could build something there. A life. Together. If you'll have me. A half-breed Apache with too many scars and too many ghosts." Margaret laughed, the sound bright in the desert night. "Only if you'll have a widow who's not really a widow, who killed her husband and has been running ever since." "Then we're matched well," Samuel said, pulling her close. "Two people the world wants to forget, choosing to remember each other. When Samuel was strong enough to travel, they prepared to leave the oasis. The journey north would take another week, but they had water now, and hope, and each other. As they packed their few possessions, Margaret made a decision. She took out the wanted poster bearing her image and her true name. With solemn ceremony, she burned it in their campfire, watching Catherine Morrison disappear in smoke and ash. "Who are you now?" Samuel asked. "I am Braveheart Woman," she said firmly. "Wife of Samuel Crow Feather. If he'll have me, nothing before that matters. In my people's way, speaking makes it so." Samuel said, "Before the spirits of this place, I take you as my wife. You are no longer alone, and you are no longer alone. Margaret responded, Before whatever God watches over this desert, I take you as my husband. We are one path now. They left the oasis as the dawn painted the rocks in shades of rose and gold. The mare, rested and watered, carried their supplies while they walked together, hand in hand when the trail permitted. The Badlands still stretched before them, harsh and unforgiving, but no longer quite so terrible. 5 days later, they climbed out of a final canyon and saw it, a green valley nestled between protective hills, smoke rising from scattered homesteads, a river glinting silver in the morning light, the promised land, where their pasts could finally be laid to rest. As they descended toward their new life, Margaret thought about the strange journey that had brought them here, a proud Apache who'd won a widow in a game, only to discover she was far more than she seemed, a woman whose hidden past had shattered his pride, only to rebuild it with shared understanding. They had faced the desert, the law, their own demons, and emerged not unscathed but unbroken. At the valley's edge, they were met by a Mexican man with kind eyes and careful movements. He looked at them, the Apache man and the white woman, dusty and worn from the desert, hands clasped together, and simply nodded. "Welcome," he said. "There's land by the river. If you're looking to settle, good soil, peaceful neighbors." "We're looking for peace," Samuel said. "Then you found it. Friend, what name should we know you by?" Samuel glanced at Margaret, a question in his eyes. She smiled and answered for them both. "Samuel and Margaret Crowfeather, come from the south, looking to build." The man smiled. "Building is good. Welcome home, Crowfeathers." Home. The word settled around them like a blessing. As they followed their guide into the valley, Margaret felt the last chains of her past fall away. Behind them lay Catherine Morrison and the proud Apache who had trusted no one. Ahead lay Samuel and Margaret Crowfeather, building a life in a place that asked not who you had been, but who you chose to be. The sun climbed higher, warm but not cruel here, lighting their way into a future neither could have imagined that night in Murphy's saloon. Love had found them in the most unlikely way, through a card game and a dangerous wager. But perhaps that was how the best love stories began, not with gentle courtship, but with two broken souls recognizing in each other the possibility of becoming whole. As they crossed the river into their new life, an eagle circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. Margaret remembered Samuel's grandmother's story and smiled. Sometimes the wounded did learn to fly again. Sometimes they even soared. In the green valley where misfits made their refuge, where the past held no dominion and the future stretched bright with promise, Samuel and Margaret Crowfeather began to build a home first, then a life, then a love that would become legend in its own right, the Apache warrior and his brave heart woman, proof that even in the harshest desert, hope could bloom. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. I'd love to hear where in the world you're enjoying these stories. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on Margaret and Samuel's journey. Did their love story touch your heart as it did mine? Until our next adventure on the frontier, partners.